The appeal of an idyllic life in a picturesque, quaint town has all the romantics cooing.
3 bodies uncovered in the woods east of McAllister. Friends of a family that's been missing for more than 4 years neared that area.
But nestled far away from the hustle-bustle and safety of a big city, they also serve as a perfect setting for something dark and sinister.
Mother, father, and a 6-year-old child disappeared.
You get a group of characters that all know each other, gossip, and a set group of suspects to point figures at. But there are always secrets, and secrets always come out. Or do they really? Let's find out in our list of 20 worst small-town mysteries. Number 20. Girl Scout murder, Locust Grove, Oklahoma. A quaint town in Oklahoma is haunted by a dark past. It's been more than 40 years since 3 young Girl Scouts were brutally slain at their campsite near Locust Grove, Oklahoma. Lori Farmer, 8, and tent mates Michelle Goose and 10-year-old Denise Milner were all raped and murdered on June 13, 1977.
Campers Lori Farmer, Michelle Gousset, and Denise Milner were raped and murdered in Mays County, and even though a suspect was arrested,
a 10-month manhunt led authorities to arrest and charge a convicted rapist with ties to the area who had escaped from jail 4 years earlier. A twice convicted rapist, 33-year-old Jean Leroy Hart, was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the girls' deaths. However, a jury acquitted him of the charges, and 2 months later, he died of a heart attack.
And raping 2 pregnant women 10 years before.
The unsolved killings have become one of Oklahoma's most notorious cold cases. A single strand of hair is what remains as a clue to find out the killer's identity. The authorities and the people hope new DNA testing can finally put to rest this 40-year-old case that has haunted their town. But what happened when an accident on a fishing boat revealed a gruesome truth which has now become Alaska's biggest mystery? Find out in the next case. Number 19. Death on the water in Alaska. On September 6, 1982, after receiving a distress call to put out a fire on a fishing boat, Alaska Police Chief Ray Shapley rushed to help. He found that the deck of the boat was empty and black smoke was coming out of the wheelhouse. And after hours of trying to put out the flames, Alaska police realized that the 8 victims on board the Investor were not victims of a tragic accident. They'd been killed in a homicide. The slaying of skipper Mark Colthurst and his pregnant wife Irene, both 28, along with their children Kimberly, 5, and John, 4, and 4 deckhands Chris Heyman, 18, and Keon Moon and Mike Stewart, all 19, is still Alaska's worst unsolved mass homicide. The killer moved in plain sight as investigations revealed that he had killed the family and crew before leaving the shore. He then dumped the bodies inside the 58-foot fishing boat and moved the vessel to a secluded bay, all of it in broad daylight. 2 years after the murders, police arrested John Peel, who worked for Mark. He would later be acquitted of the charges, and no arrests have been made since. Peel sued the state of Alaska for wrongful prosecution and received a $900,000 financial settlement. The Investor murders remain a painful, chilling memory for the local people that refuses to fade away. Up next, a family of 3 which mysteriously disappears in 2009 is found 4 years later, dead. Number 18. A family vanishes. In October 2009, Bobby, 44, 40-year-old Sherilyn Jameson, and their 6-year-old daughter, Madison, mysteriously vanished in the town of Eufaula, Oklahoma. 9 days later, the family's abandoned truck was found near their home, though there had been no signs of a struggle. Inside the vehicle were the couple's wallets, phones, and $32,000 in cash. The family's dog was also found in the truck, malnourished but alive. It appeared the family had disappeared into thin air. A search party was formed, and investigators combed through miles of woods and the surrounding area, looking for any trace of the Jameson family. They turned up nothing. The case was closed soon after. But 4 years later, the case would come searingly back into all the major headlines.
County authorities confirmed the remains of 2 adults and 1 child were found by deer hunters this weekend. This morning, the medical examiner is working to confirm their identities. The Jamison family, a mother, father, and a 6-year-old child, disappeared in 2009. The family disappeared while looking to buy land near Red Oak, Oklahoma, just east of McAllister. Their truck was found abandoned 3 miles north.
In 2013, hunters found the family's skeletal remains 3 miles away, lying face down and side by side in the woods. An autopsy report was inconclusive due to incomplete skeleton remains. The Jamison family case seemed to have many leads, including a possibility of suicide, drug overdose, and threats, but none of them led anywhere conclusive, and investigators remained unsure of what to make of their mysterious disappearance and death. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. In our next mystery, a small hike that included clicking pictures turned out to be fatal for 2 best friends. What did they stumble upon? Let's find out. Number 17, a nature walk goes wrong. Best friends Abigail Abby Williams and Liberty German were enjoying a nature walk early in 2017 when things took a terrible turn. The girls, who were dropped off at a Delphi, Indiana community trail in the early afternoon of February 13, never returned home. The next day, their bodies were found less than a mile from where they were last seen alive.
13-year-old Abigail Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German disappeared in February 2017. Their bodies were found just 1 day later in a wooded area.
Police later discovered that Liberty, 14, had taken pictures and videos on her phone of an unidentified man authorities believe is the suspect in her and 13-year-old Abigail's deaths. But after 5 years of manhunt and trials, police believe that they have their suspect. This mystery is very close to getting solved, and hopefully, the victim's family and the locals can finally find some closure.
State police booked Allen Friday after searching his home, towed his car, and dug through a backyard fire pit. Investigators had previously only released sketches of a suspect and a video of the possible killer found on Libby's phone. Now, over the years, investigators reviewed thousands of leads, but no arrests were made until now. State police saying today is not a day to celebrate, and calling this a long and complex investigation, and that today is about the victims.
But how does a case of a daylight murder robbery with multiple witnesses still remain a mystery for authorities even after 30 years? Up next, number 16, Below Supermarket triple slaying. On a warm June evening in 1993, a man entered a Windsor, North Carolina Below Supermarket and wreaked havoc on 6 employees, binding them with duct tape before piling them on top of another and opening fire. Local authorities say the gruesome scene can never be forgotten. 3 of the employees were fatally shot, 2 survived with injuries, and 1 was, amazingly, not harmed.
Police say it was the worst crime a small town in North Carolina has ever experienced.
So horrific that even today it continues to haunt residents in Windsor. Even worse, the killer's never been caught.
The surviving victims described the suspect as a slender and solid-built black male who looked around 30 years old. He had light brown eyes that were slanted and a narrow nose bridge that may have possibly endured a sports injury. He was sporting a military-style haircut. Police said the motive was robbery and that about $3,000 was taken. A $30,000 reward is still being offered for information leading to the killer's arrest. But next up on our list is an agonizing case that has haunted the rural town of Mississippi. Number 15, Teen's Burning Death. In December 2014, the quaint rural Cortland, Mississippi, was rocked by a harrowing incident when 19-year-old Jessica Chambers was found burning to death on the side of a road. Chambers, a former high school cheerleader, died from her injuries. Authorities have said they believe she tried to identify her killer as she burned. Jessica was last seen on grainy gas station footage that shows her walking towards a gas station 90 minutes before first responders discovered her on fire about 1 mile from the gas station. The footage shows Jessica waving before she walks over to speak with someone.
dressed in a black sweater and loose pajama pants. The video shows her about to enter the store. When it appears, she waves to someone she knows before turning left and walking out of the frame.
In October, a mistrial was declared in the murder trial of Chambers' acquaintance Quentin Tellis, 29, who was arrested in 2016 after an extensive investigation and who has maintained his innocence.
The jury started deliberating Sunday afternoon around 2:30 and called it a day around 7 p.m. last night. They began again around 9 o'clock this morning. Now, the judge sent them back a few times today to keep trying, but after nearly 12 hours,
prosecutors say they will retry him. Meanwhile, Jessica's family is still trying to grapple with her death and why someone would want her dead. The question will continue to linger until Jessica's killer is found. But this next unsolved mystery has bamboozled the minds of the authorities and investigators. Number 16. Where are the Sodder children? When George and Jenny Sodder go to bed on Christmas Eve in 1945, 9 of their 10 children are at home. Their 10th is serving in the military. But a fire breaks out, and by the next morning, the Sodder house has been burned to the ground. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children make it out. However, the other 5 children, who range in age from 5 to 14, are never seen again. As time goes on, more details emerge that cast doubt on whether the 5 missing Sodder children have actually died in the fire. The family remembers some odd events around that time, which seem odd upon investigation. Jenny is awakened earlier in the night by a noise that sounds like something hitting the roof. The family receives what they think is an odd prank phone call just after midnight on the night of the fire. Additionally, a ladder has been moved from its storage area near the house to more than 75 feet away, hindering George's attempts to reach his children's upstairs bedrooms to rescue them. In another strange twist, the bones of the missing children are never recovered, despite the fact that the fire does not appear to have burned long enough or hot enough to destroy human bones. The Sodder family theorized that the children had been kidnapped, perhaps in an attempt to extort money, perhaps to coerce George into joining the local mafia, or perhaps in retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and Italy's fascist government. From the 1950s until Jenny Sodder's death in the late 1980s, the Sodder family maintained a billboard on State Route 16 with pictures of the 5 vanished children and offering a reward for information. Up next is a murder scene so gruesome that it remains in public discourse for well over a century. Number 15. The Saxtown Axe Murders. Saxtown is a small town outside of Millstadt, Illinois, and it was made up of mostly German immigrants. It's also home to a gruesome, unsolved murder that took place during the night of March 19 and the morning of March 20, 1874. It's believed that someone knocked on the door of the Stelzrieds farmhouse, and when Fritz Stelzriede responded to the knocks, he was killed with an axe. From there, the killer went through the house and killed Fritz's father, his mother, his grandfather, his 3-year-old brother, and his 8-year-old sister. All of them were killed with an axe, and a few also had their throats slit. A neighbor found the bodies on the afternoon of March 20th. He'd come over to check on the Stelzriedes since he hadn't seen anyone working on the farm that day. Before the murders, Frederick Stelzriede told some friends that he had just received a substantial inheritance from Germany. The Stelzriede estate was reportedly worth several $1,000s at the time of the murder. Police now tie themselves to the theory that the murder of the family was intended to eliminate all heirs to the estate. Police discovered that very little was taken from the home, leading them to believe the motive was personal. Up next, in a bizarre case where a report about an infant that was taken away from a home ended in the worst possible way. Number 14. Nicole Lee Hattemer. On the night of December 26, 1989, 10-month-old Nicole Lee Hattemer disappeared from her crib in her grandparents' home in Holcomb, Wisconsin. The baby's teenage mother, her grandparents, and the mother's younger brother and sister were all home at the time. No one could find the baby. The family called 911 and first responders searched the area. Shortly after midnight, the baby's frozen body was found lying face down 22 meters from the house in the backyard. An autopsy was performed, showing that the infant died from either a chest injury or exposure. The police believe that the chest injury was caused when Nicole was thrown several feet and landed on her chest, which caused internal bleeding. The unsolved murder haunted the community, which only had a population of 920 people. The FBI investigated the crime in 1992, but didn't turn up any leads. At the trial in 1990, Nicole's grandparents, Lou Ann and Lee Hadimer, pleaded the fifth on some questions. Also, the retired sheriff who worked on the case said that he found it puzzling that no one from the Hadimer family had ever called the sheriff's department to check on the progress of the case. Police believe that the only way the crime will be solved is if someone confesses or comes forward with new information. Number 13. The Grand Prairie Killings. On July 20th, 1918, in Grand Prairie, Alberta, a town with around 1,000 people, a local discovered that the house shared by Joseph Snyder and his son Stanley was on fire. After the fire subsided, police found both Snyders inside. They had been shot, and there was a .38 caliber revolver lying near Joseph. At first, it was believed to be a tragic murder-suicide. That changed 4 days later when people noticed a strange smell at Ignace Patton's farm 7 kilometers away. A group of men went to investigate, and they found the dead bodies of Patton, Minister Frank Perchovsky, and trappers Charles Zimner and John Wunwand. Patton's throat had been slit, but the other 3 men had all been shot in the head. It turned out that the gun used to kill the Snyders actually belonged to Patton, meaning that the killer slaughtered everyone at the Patton farm before moving on to the Snyders. The motive behind the killings at the Patton farm was most likely robbery. Patton and Wunwand had just withdrawn $5,000 from the bank to purchase a ranch. After the murder, only $108 were found. Then, in September, bloody bills started to get into circulation in Grand Prairie, and they all came from the bank in the town, but the teller couldn't remember who had brought in the bloody bills. The neighbor who discovered the bodies of the Snyders was the only one ever charged with the crimes, but with no evidence against him, he was acquitted in less than an hour. Next, the brutal murder shocked the people of Leland, a small community where a mother was killed before her 2-year-old son. Number 12. The Waterbed Murder. At around noon on February 23, 1987, Beverly J. Potter Midz's mother, Lauren Potter, stopped by Beverly's house in Leland, North Carolina, which had a population of fewer than 2,000 people. When she got there, she found her daughter's door unlocked, which she thought was rather strange. Potter entered the house and heard her 2-year-old grandson crying in the back room. She went to Beverly's bedroom and found her 23-year-old daughter bound and motionless on her bed. Her head was covered in a pillowcase, and the room was splattered with blood. Potter removed the pillowcase and discovered that her daughter's throat was slit to the point of decapitation. Potter grabbed her grandson and fled the house. The police arrived at the gory scene and determined that Beverly had been raped before she was murdered. Jay's youngest son, Andrew, just a day shy of turning 2, was at home during the ordeal, but was not harmed. Her other son, who was 4 years old, was with another grandmother at the time. All he could tell was, "Mean man hurt mommy, mommy cry."
Jay's mom, Laureen, also found the only known witness, Jay's almost 2-year-old son.
He was telling me all sorts of things. It was a white male. He pushed his way in. He had a knife. He made motion as, he was stabbing her. He apparently saw everything.
Left behind at the crime scene was a newspaper clipping of the ad Jay had placed for the waterbed. Her listing was circled. Lieutenant West told Dateline investigators believe the clipping was left behind by the killer, but the evidence has not led them to anyone. He is hoping the test results on DNA collected at the scene will eventually lead to some answers with the help of advancements in DNA technology. Other investigators disagree and think the classified ad might have been a ruse. They believe that Beverly was stalked because the killer knew there wasn't a man in the house, and he brought rope and a weapon with him to the crime scene. Also, it's believed that he was a stranger, which is why Beverly's son was left alive. Throughout the years, a number of suspects were investigated, but all of them had solid alibis. The case remains cold. Next on the list is another horrifying case of a 29-year-old mother of two who was sexually assaulted and murdered in her own home in Thatcher, Arizona. Number 11, Mary Ann Holmes. On July 9, 1995, Mary Ann Holmes, a 29-year-old single mother of two, held a yard sale at her home in Thatcher, Arizona, which had a population of roughly 4,000 at the time. During the yard sale, Holmes spoke openly about how good an idea it was because of how much money she made. The next morning, Holmes's 4-year-old daughter ran to a neighbor's house. She was bound and naked, and she said her mother was dead. The police were called. They found Holmes murdered in her bedroom. The killer had handcuffed Holmes and then used a large knife or hatchet to strike Holmes in the head until she was dead. It was believed that he sexually assaulted Holmes after her death. Sadly, Holmes's daughters were bound and forced to watch the entire attack.
This. My mom is dead. My mom is dead. When the sheriff's office arrived, they discovered that Mary Ann Holmes, who was 29 years old, was beaten upside the head, and she was sexually assaulted, and it all happened with her 2 babies sitting there on the bed watching all of it.
Over the course of the investigation, 75 people were interviewed, including an ex-boyfriend who stalked Holmes, but the case went cold. In 2013, the TNT television show Cold Justice examined the case and had the DNA evidence that was left behind tested.
Are unique to each person, but sometimes we only get a partial small profile. In that case, it can't be used as an exact match, but it can be used to exclude people. Think of it like a lottery when you only know a few of the winning numbers. In this case, David Black and John Bursey didn't have any of the numbers. So there's no way that they touched the evidence and now they can be excluded. But Philip Turley does match a few of those numbers, so we're not going to exclude him.
Unfortunately, it yielded no suspects. What they do know about the killer is that he was methodical because he brought the ropes, the handcuffs, and his weapon with him. The only description that Holmes's 4-year-old daughter could give of the man was that he was large and that he was a lion. Police are unsure if that means he had long hair like a lion's mane or if he had a lion tattoo. But what happens when the killer himself calls the police and tells them about a murder? Number 10, Georgia Jane Cruz. At around 5:30 p.m. on April 8, 1980, 12-year-old Georgia Jane Cruz walked out of her home in Monteverde, Florida, a tiny town with a population of 397 people. When the 5th grader didn't return home, her family, the police, and volunteers scoured the area for her. 2 days after she went missing, the county sheriff's department received a call from a man who said, "You know that 12-year-old girl you're looking for? She's dead." He then hung up. The man made 2 similar phone calls. One was to George's grandmother and the other to the wife of Monteverde's police marshal. The caller's claims would be confirmed 8 days later when George's decomposing body was found about 40 kilometers away in a sparsely wooded area in a park behind a Kmart. She was wearing the same clothes she'd gone missing in, and there were no signs of sexual assault. She had died as a result of a single stab wound to the back. The unsolved murder of a young girl is enough to shock any community. What was even more troubling was that pretty much everyone in town knew each other, and there were no strangers or strange vehicles spotted in the area at the time of the kidnapping. This has led to speculation that George's killer may have been a resident. Unfortunately, the phone calls were never traced, and the recording of the call made to the police department was lost. There is also very little physical evidence, and police believe that the only way the crime will be solved is if someone comes forward with new information. But in a cruel twist of fate, two kidnappings and murders 7 years apart find a connection? Find out next. Number 9. Holly Parainen and Molly Bish. On August 5, 1993, 10-year-old Holly Parainen and her brother were visiting their grandparents in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, which had a population of no more than 10,000 people. While there, they went to a neighbor's house to see some puppies. They got separated, and only her brother returned to the grandparents' cottage. The area was quickly scoured, but the only trace they found of Holly was a shoe. Her body wouldn't be found until October 23rd, less than 16 kilometers away from where she was kidnapped. Hunters found her body in a wooded area off a rural road. The disappearance and the discovery of the body reverberated throughout Massachusetts due to the senselessness and randomness of the crime. One person who reached out to the Parainen family was 10-year-old Molly Bish from the nearby town of Warren, Massachusetts. She wrote them a letter when Holly was missing, which said, "I'm very sorry. I wish I could make it up to you. Holly's a very pretty girl. She's almost as tall as me. I wish I knew Holly. I hope they found her." In a strange twist of fate, on June 27, 2000, when Molly was 16, she was working as a lifeguard at a pond near Warren, and she disappeared after her mother dropped her off. Despite a massive search and a lot of media attention, Molly's skeletal remains weren't found until June 2003. Due to the state of the body, it was impossible to tell the cause of death, but they do know that she was buried in a shallow grave 8 kilometers away from her home in a wooded area.
And murdered back in 1993 when she was just 10 years old. Now, at the time of Holly's murder, Molly Bish was also 10 years old. She was taken and murdered nearly 7 years later.
The family of Holly Parainen standing next to Hammond District Attorney Anthony Guluni on Wednesday as they plead for the community's help.
It's just been a long road, and I pray that the person responsible for this will confess, come forward, or at least someone that he knows who may have a conscience would do the right thing now and contact the police.
On Wednesday, investigators asked the public for any information relating to this white tank top with pink, purple, and blue letters that read Boston on the chest. They describe it as a piece of evidence in the cold case of Holly's unsolved murder. The 10-year-old was abducted from Sturbridge in 1993. Her body found a few months later in Brimfield. The tank top also found at that scene. Heather Bish remembers Holly's story as she grew up in Warren, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, 7 years later, she would experience the same pain as the Parainen family when her sister Molly Bish went missing.
Besides the letter, the girls being kidnapped from the same region of Massachusetts and their bodies found in a similar dumping ground, it's unclear if the two murders are connected. That being said, they do share some prime suspects. In 2012, a man named David Puleo was linked to Holly's murder. Investigators claim to have DNA evidence showing that Puleo was in the area at the time of the kidnapping, but the evidence didn't definitively link him to the kidnapping or the murder. Unfortunately, the police were never able to ask Puleo about the DNA evidence because he passed away from natural causes in 2003. Two brothers, Rodney and Randy Stanger, are also suspects. Rodney was a suspect in Molly's death, and Randy is a prime suspect in Holly's murder. Rodney is currently serving 25 years for stabbing his girlfriend to death in February 2008. A final suspect in both murder cases was Gerald Battistoni, who was camping in the area at the time of the murders. He never confessed to the murders, and he died in 2014. Despite a few strong suspects, no one has ever been charged with either crime. But next, in a twisted story where the family history of the victims dug up facts even stranger than the crime. Number 8. The Coons family. The Coons family were a reclusive group that consisted of 4 elderly siblings who'd never married and had lived in the farmhouse their whole life. They were Irene, aged 82, Clarence, aged 76, Marie, aged 72, and Helen, aged 70. The other 2 members of the Coons family were Helen's sons, Kenneth and Randy. Randy lived in the house and was around his mother a lot, while Kenneth lived in a trailer beside the house. On the morning of July 4th, 1987, Kenneth made a horrific discovery. Irene, Clarence, Marie, and his 30-year-old brother Randy were all dead. They had all been shot 2 times in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Helen was missing. When the police arrived at the house, they found out that the Coonses were hoarders and their place was packed with garbage. There was also a lot of money stashed throughout the house, $20,000 in all. This made it difficult for the police to be sure that the motive was robbery because there was no way to know how much money was originally in the house. While Helen was missing, she was considered a suspect because she'd bought .22 caliber ammunition weeks before the murders, and she'd complained to the owner of the hardware store that she was mad at her family for watching dirty movies. Randy supposedly ordered the VHS tapes, and Helen had paid for them. Some strange family history also came to light while Helen was missing. In 1905, the 4 Coons siblings' grandmother was murdered by her son, J. Wenzel Coons. He was committed to a mental institution after the murder. Then, in 1932, when Helen was 15, she got pregnant with Kenneth, and the Coons family said that their neighbor, Frank Gums, a 40-year-old convicted bootlegger, raped her. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 months and died shortly after serving his sentence. At his trial, Gums' defense lawyer said he wasn't the father and insisted that Helen's brother Clarence was the actual father. Witnesses said that Helen and Clarence were inseparable, and in interviews after the killings, Kenneth said that his father was Clarence. He wasn't sure who Randy's father was. 9 months after the massacre, Helen's body was found buried in a swamp 28 kilometers away. The only person charged in relation to the murders was 23-year-old Chris Jacobs III. He was charged with being a party to the murders in 1989. He also owned a .22 caliber rifle. Also, Jacob supposedly knew that the family might have money because he'd purchased his car from Kenneth years before the murder, and he'd apparently seen an envelope full of cash. Jacobs was acquitted of the murders due to lack of evidence. But later, his ex-girlfriend, Stacy Weiss, said that Jacobs confessed to killing the Coonses. Weiss only came forward after she was arrested in connection with a bank robbery and home burglary in Minnesota. This time, Jacobs was found guilty and sentenced to 31 years in prison. Up next is one of the most brutal, heartbreaking, and unsolved mysteries in the history of modern France. Number 7. Gregory Villemine, the Crow murder. Le Ponget-sur-Vologne is a small village in northeast France with a population of less than 1,000 people. On October 16, 1984, the body of the 4-year-old Gregory Villemine was found floating in the Vologne River, about 7 kilometers away from his home. Gregory's hands and feet were bound, and he had drowned. The day after the murder, Gregory's parents received a letter in the mail that read, "I hope you die of grief, boss. Your money can't give you back your son. Here's my revenge, you stupid bastard." The letter had been sent the day of the murder from the post office in town.
Gregory a été enlevé devant chez lui alors qu'il jouait sur ce tas de gravier. La dernière menace qu'a pu entendre sa famille était celle d'un homme qui disait au téléphone, le gamin est dans...
Gregory's parents, Christine and Jean-Marie Villemine, knew who was responsible for the murder, but they didn't know his true identity. It was a mysterious man whom the media nicknamed the Crow. The Crow had been harassing the Villemines for at least 3 years before the murder by making obscene and threatening phone calls, but the voice was never identified. There were a number of suspects in the case. The first was Bernard LaRoche, Jean-Marie's cousin. In February 1985, LaRoche was cleared of all charges, which infuriated Jean-Marie. While speaking with journalists, Jean-Marie vowed that he would kill his cousin. True to his word, he shot LaRoche to death on March 29 as LaRoche was leaving work. Jean-Marie was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison.
4 ou 5 personnes parmi les proches de la famille Villemain restent fortement suspectées.
On voit bien que les photographes
faire de l'assassinat du petit Grégory.
Nous avons 2 témoins qui nous donnent le même portrait robot.
Bernard est innocent, mon beau-frère il est innocent.
Les gens criaient à mort.
Gregory's mother, Christine, was also a suspect in the murder. She was seen at the post office on the day of the murder. Cords similar to those used to bind Gregory were found in the family's basement, and the handwriting analysis from the letter implicated her. She was even held as a suspect in July 1985, but then a judge forbade any prosecution of her. Another interesting fact about the case is that there is plenty of DNA evidence, including saliva left on the stamp and DNA left on the cords. When the cords were tested in 2013, the results were inconclusive, which makes the likelihood of finding the identity of the Crow and the killer at the heart of Affaire de Gregory very unlikely. The next case is straight from a horrorcore genre film. A small town, a bride in a wedding dress who died and haunts the residents. All the ingredients of a horror film. Number 6. The Italian Bride, Elmhurst, Illinois. In the small town of Elmhurst, Illinois, there's a cemetery with a creepy myth. The cemetery contains a life-sized marble statue of a woman. If that weren't unusual enough, the woman is wearing a wedding dress. All through the area, local legends persist. Locals have reported the smell of fresh flowers and seeing a ghostly figure moving through the cemetery at night, and even at the nearby high school. The woman who is immortalized by the statue is Julia Bucola Petta. Petta died over 100 years ago in 1921 during childbirth. Not only was Petta a new mother, but she was also newly married. Her family elected to bury her in her wedding dress. According to the myth, Petta's mother repeatedly had nightmares following her daughter's death. This is creepy enough on its own, but her daughter spoke directly to her in her nightmares, commanding her to open her grave. The grave was reopened, and Julia Bucola Petta was incredibly well preserved. Petta's mother raised funds to have a statue commissioned, and the myth continued to spread and expand from there. Fair warning, if this small town myth creeps you out, be careful. They're just going to get more creepy. Number 5. The Bunnyman. The town of Clifton, Virginia is home to a myth, the legend of the Bunnyman. This was back in the early 1900s, but the legend persists. The origin of the Bunnyman is connected to a local asylum. Patients from the asylum were being transported when their vehicle crashed. One patient escaped and became the Bunnyman. He was given his name because when police were looking for him, they kept finding skinned, partially eaten rabbits. In particular, many of these rabbits were hung on the Fairfax Bridge. In October of 1970, more than 60 years after the bus crash, several people reported seeing a man in a white suit with bunny ears and carrying a hatchet. Does this make anyone else think of the movie Donnie Darko? The town of Clifton embraces the legend now, particularly around Halloween. Next is a heartbreaking murder of a 6-year-old child beauty queen in her family's Colorado home. More than a quarter century later, her killer remains a mystery. Number 4. The case of a child beauty queen. On December 26, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado, Patsy Ramsey claimed to have discovered a ransom note for her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenet Ramsey, on the back staircase inside the Ramsey home. This prompted her to call the police at 5:52 a.m. to report JonBenet as missing. The only people inside the house were John Ramsey, her father, Patsy, her mother, and her brother Burke.
Police, what's going on by 515th Street? What's going on there, ma'am?
It is one of the greatest unsolved crimes in history.
We have a kidnapping. There's a ransom note here.
A little girl vanishes from home.
Oddly enough, JonBenet's body was found inside the home in the utility room in the basement less than 8 hours later. The body was found by John, and duct tape was found across her mouth, and a smooth cord was around her neck. When police arrived, it was suspected that the crime scene was heavily compromised due to multiple people arriving at the scene. The police had also claimed that they had not searched the house after Patsy's initial call because there was no reason to believe that JonBenet was in the house. At the time of her death, JonBenet was known as a child beauty queen superstar, having won at least 5 high-end child beauty competitions. Her death was ultimately ruled a homicide. The autopsy stated that JonBenet's official cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. Due to JonBenet's beauty queen popularity and her mother being a former beauty queen, the case caused nationwide and media interest.
The mall.
John and Patsy Ramsey published a New York Times bestseller in 2000 titled The Death of Innocence, and gave a sit-down interview to Barbara Walters, steadfastly maintaining that no one from their family had killed JonBenet. Even after several rounds of DNA testing, the crime is still unsolved and remains an open investigation with the Boulder Police Department. Next up is a century-old mass murder case in Bavaria, Germany, which has dumbfounded authorities and locals alike. Number 3. The unsolved Hinterkaifeck murders. On the evening of March 31, 1922, on Hinterkaifeck Farm in Bavaria, Germany, 6 residents were murdered with a pickaxe. The victims included husband and wife Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children Cecilia and Joseph, and the family's maid Maria Baumgartner. 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib, and Maria was killed in her bed, while the rest of the family was then murdered in the barn and stacked on top of each other. Upon the discovery, authorities concluded that the murderer actually lived on the farm for 6 days after they committed the crime. Even after the family had died, cattle were still being fed, meals were being eaten in the kitchen. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney, and the family dog was tied up to a post when the mailman came on Saturday. The bodies were discovered the next day. What makes this crime even more chilling was that Maria was actually hired the same day she was killed, replacing the previous maid who had quit 6 months earlier due to the house being haunted. She reported to the family hearing footsteps in the attic and voices. Around the time the previous maid had quit, the Gruber family had also begun to hear voices from the attic. Andreas had also noticed a set of house keys had gone missing, an unfamiliar newspaper in the house that he had never seen before, plus scratches on the family's tool shed like someone had tried to pick the lock. He had also reported seeing a pair of unfamiliar footsteps leading from the woods toward the back entrance of the family's home. Despite repeated arrests, no murder has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955 and the house was demolished. Next up is a case that involves a triple slaying and a missing child whose remains were later found. On April 12, 1981, in Keddie, California, the Sharp family and some friends went to sleep inside Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort Lodge. Sheila Sharp would wake up to find her mother Sue, her brother Johnny, and their family friend Dana Wingate brutally murdered inside the cabin, while her 12-year-old sister Tina was missing from the scene.
Triple slaying in Keddie. It reads, a quiet pale of horror blanketed Keddie. 3 people were found bludgeoned and cut to death. The worst crime in Plumas County. The victims? Glenna Sue Sharp, her mother, John Sharp, Glenna's son, Tina Sharp, Glenna's daughter, and Dana Wingate, John's friend. Their photos printed in the Feather River Bulletin. Their bodies were found by Sheila Sharp.
Sheila only escaped the murders by sleeping at a friend's cabin next door. Surprisingly, they found Sheila's 2 younger brothers, Greg and Rick, and their friend Justin Smart, asleep in another bedroom inside Cabin 28 and safe. Tina's remains would be found by an anonymous tip on the 3rd anniversary of the murders. Her skull was found 50 miles away from Keddie in a different county.
Then, on April 22, 1984, a little more than 3 years after the murders, someone collecting bottles in the woods in rural Butte County, about 100 miles from Keddie, found human remains. The remains belonged to Tina Sharp. Shortly after news broke of the discovery, a mysterious phone call came into the Butte County Sheriff's Office.
And I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie, up in Plumas County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found.
Whoever made the call knew something specific about what happened.
There were only 2 suspects that the police examined, Marty Smart and his roommate, Bo Bubiday. Marty, who was an abusive husband, didn't like Sheila counseling his wife. Soon after the murders, Marty left Keddie for Reno, Nevada. Law enforcement felt the murders took more than one person to conduct, which is why they took Bubiday into questioning as an accomplice. Bubiday was also an ex-con.
Investigators named 2 primary suspects, Martin Smart, a neighbor to the Sharps, and his friend John Bobiday. Martin Smart initially told investigators he was missing a hammer. The hammer belonging to Martin Smart was recently found in 2016 in a pond down the road from where Cabin 28 once stood.
Despite there being so much more to the case, the investigation oddly, stopped there. There was evidence that seemingly went unnoticed and people of interest that were not examined properly. The murderer of the Keddie crime has not been identified, and the case remains unsolved. Which brings us to number 1, the disappearance of the 18-year-old Bennington College student, which directly led to the formation of the Vermont State Police in 1947. Number 1, the disappearance of Paula Jean Welden. On December 1, 1946, a sophomore at Bennington College, 18-year-old Paula Jean Welden, told her roommate Elizabeth Parker she was going for a long walk but failed to return. Local witnesses reported having seen her on the 270-mile trail called Vermont's Long Trail that cuts through Vermont to the Canadian border. A search party was immediately formed, but no clues were found on the trail. Soon after, strange leads began to materialize. There was one in particular made by a Massachusetts waitress that she'd served an agitated young woman matching Paula's description. Upon learning of this lead, Paula's father disappeared for 36 hours, supposedly in pursuit of the lead. Nevertheless, the authorities thought it was strange, and it led to him becoming a prime suspect in Paula's disappearance. Stories began circulating that Paula's home life was not nearly as idyllic and picturesque as her parents had initially reported to police. Apparently, Paula had not returned home for Thanksgiving the week prior, and she may have been upset about a disagreement with her father. While claiming his innocence, Paula's father posited a theory that Paula was distraught about a boy she liked at school, and that perhaps the boy should have been a suspect. Over the next decade after Paula's disappearance, a local Bennington man twice bragged to friends that he knew where Paula's body was buried. However, he was unable to lead the police to anybody. In the decades since Welden went missing, the cold case has haunted the college and state authorities alike. With no evidence of a crime, no body, and no forensic clues, the fate of Paula Jean Welden was never discovered. These cases serve to remind us of the fickle and vicious nature of man. These horrific crimes changed these small towns forever. Thanks for watching along. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up. Also, tell us which case broke your heart.